I'm Jennifer Carroll. I'm the Director of Education here at the Historical Society. I first want to thank the Human Rights Committee for considering us as your topic for today's wonderful event. We've attended your events in the past and happy to be a part of it today. We're an educational nonprofit organization dedicated to collecting, preserving, and communicating our local history. And this is work we've been doing for 96 years. For today's program, I wanted to get started with a little exercise. So I invite you all to look at this document, analyze this document together, and feel free to call out anything that you're noticing. But first and foremost, what kind of document are we looking at today? It is a census, and for some of you maybe closer to the front, maybe you could see what town we're looking at. Keene, yes, we're looking at an 1870 census for Keene. I blew it up a little bit so we can see. But what are some of the things that we're seeing with this census? What's happening here? Occupations, yep, ages, you can see that. I've highlighted one household in particular. Anything else anyone want to share? Yes. Yeah. The name highlighted in yellow is Phoebe Simmons. Here on this census, she's listed as Phoebe, but her race is indicated as Black. Yeah. So you can see she's living within the household of Jonathan Robinson, and he is a farmer in town. He seems to be doing quite well. And we have I believe his wife and his son living with him as well. She's a domestic servant. She's 69 years old, and she's blind. Also in the street are other farmers. One other family also has a domestic servant. This happens to be an era where a lot of the families along Main Street, this is Main Street, these families. The Robinsons lived down closer to Route 101 intersection. A lot of the families ended up having cooks and domestic servants in their households. So we can see that Phoebe is living within this household, working as a domestic. So what questions then does a document like this call to mind? And how can we begin to learn more about a person based on one document in one moment in time? So sometimes learning as much as possible about anyone else within a household means that we're researching the head of household in a family. Moving forward in time to the 1880 census, we find Phoebe moved on. She's now residing with Jonathan Robinson's son, Charles, and they're living on Lincoln Street in Keene. She doesn't show up in the 1900 census, indicating she most likely died, and we begin then to trace backwards from the 1870 census to see what else we can learn about her life. And from our research, we find that Phoebe worked as a domestic servant in the Robinson household as early as 1840, so at least 40 to 45 years, that the family also had moved from Surrey to Keene at some time in the 1850s, and she came with them. This is a snippet of that 1840 census. So when I say we feel that she was most likely working with him that long, what we can notice, and I'm not going to have you all try to read this is awful, but Robinson Jonathan is the head of household, and basically in the 1840 census, the head of household is who is named. Anybody else was just a tick mark, and so it was sorted then by race, by gender, and by age range. And so if you look to the far right, you can see then that under free colored persons, female is a female. She's aged 30, I believe it was 36 to 55. And so we can assume then that Phoebe was living with them at that time. So the other thing to look at then is how many people of color were living in Surrey in 1840. And when we look at the aggregate, the totals at the end, we could see that aside from Phoebe, there was one male aged 10 to 24 living in another household. So 2 people of color living in Surrey in 1840, and we don't know if they knew each other. We don't know if there was a relationship or a connection in any way. But looking at these census records, you can see how difficult it might be then to identify anyone who wasn't the head of household. But collectively, if we can find enough, something concrete, we could start to piece together a rough timeline of a person's life. And the caveat is that they had to have resided within the community long enough in order to do that, which has been a very difficult part of this project. So with some digging, we can hope to create a timeline, as I say. So we did do research. We looked for birth records, marriage records for Phoebe, and we haven't turned up anything. So we're going to come back to her a little bit later, because Phoebe Simmons is actually one of 458 individuals that we now have identified as part of this research initiative to recover Black history in the Monadnock region from 1730 to 1930. Community members in small towns, small New Hampshire towns, at times come into their local historical society and ask the question, was my house on the Underground Railroad? And often they hear stories or find a small room behind a fireplace or a trapdoor in a floor that leads to a tunnel. And homeowners would really like to know if their house played a role in one of the most amazing humanitarian efforts in our country's history. Yet many of our historical societies are not filled with collections that could prove the existence of an Underground Railroad in our communities, which is understandable. It would have been secretive. We do not have an Underground Railroad collection. A lot of what we know in our communities comes to us from stories that have been passed down through generations that then make it into town histories, newspaper articles, publications over time. But what more can we learn to verify information that we have? About 5 years ago, the Black Heritage Trail of New Hampshire held a symposium on this topic. An archaeologist and historian, Jennifer Carroll, spoke about her book, The Geography of Resistance, Free Black Communities, and the Underground Railroad. LaRoche began by imploring us in New Hampshire to stop focusing first on the architecture of a building to interpret our community's Black history or the history of the Underground Railroad. But rather, she instructed us to learn more about the individuals and families of color themselves. Otherwise, inadvertently, we tend to focus our attention only on the white homeowners, continuing to paint the story of the Underground Railroad in New England as a story of white abolitionists only assisting poor, frightened, enslaved folk. By researching individuals of color in our towns first, we may come to know, to understand the intricate networks and relationships that were in place locally, and the ways in which our own communities of color were empowered to provide enslaved individuals and families a successful path to freedom. In LaRoche's mind, perhaps the Underground Railroad is not a set route used over and over again as we learned in school, but rather an intricate series of paths that crisscross through New England and other parts of the United States based on who you knew. Relationships between like-minded individuals where stories incorporate the landscape more than the individual dwellings. Stories that follow waterways, hills, mountains, swamps, fields, and homes. This project, we hope, will provide us with more on that topic, but it's also challenging us to explore slavery present here in our region. Another important part of this project, too, is to explore a more dynamic story of African Americans beyond the history of slavery, to examine life into the 20th century. And what are the trusted sources then at our disposal that can help us create a more inclusive story of our town, our region, or our state? Here's a picture of George Miller. I'm going to ask Alan, which theater was he manager? The Latches, right? So some of you may remember George or hearing of George Miller. But interesting, the story is that he had been a chauffeur for a wealthy man who ended up coming and staying at the Cheshire House Hotel at Central Square in the early part of the 20th century, and that he never left. We do find him in census records as a bellboy in the Cheshire House Hotel. We also see that he's moving back and forth between New York and here. He has a wife and a baby in New York City. He shows up in the census twice in the same year. Which happens more often than not. And so finally the family ends up moving here. He becomes a theater manager, which is a theater that shows the film Lost Boundaries on the history of the Johnston family who lived here. And so in 1952, when Ebony Magazine came to do an article to talk to the Johnston family about the impact the film had on their lives, they also interviewed community members, including George Miller. So this is the first photo that I've seen of him. And photos would be a wonderful addition if we can keep those coming. Turning the page. So that symposium led me to wonder, what might we do here for Cheshire County? What might the historical societies and museums in our region have preserved that could lead us to a new understanding of African American history in our region? Valerie Cunningham and Jerry M. Bogus, have many others connected with the Black Heritage Trail in New Hampshire and Portsmouth, have been instrumental in reshaping our understanding of Black history in New Hampshire, especially in the Seacoast region. Their efforts have also supported other New Hampshire towns as they commemorate Black history. The Warner Historical Society's Rebecca Cursor and Lynn Clark have been doing research on this for over a decade, recognizing that what we know of African American history in our state is incomplete. They set out to analyze primary sources related to the towns of Warner, Newport, Goshen, Croydon, and Sutton. Clark and Cursor's findings were published in Historical New Hampshire Journal in 2007 and provide a first look at New Hampshire's early rural Black history. Other research has begun in Exeter, Ashland, Hancock, Peterborough, and elsewhere across the state. And this is exciting because at some point there's an opportunity for all of us to pull together and analyze our findings statewide. So I had always envisioned this work this as a citizen archivist project. We've done citizen archivist projects in the past. Some of you are familiar with citizen scientists and may have helped with salamander crossings and all of that. Citizen archivists we're inside more. So inviting the general public to participate in our research process. So it's work we could do ourselves, but I'd really prefer to provide an opportunity for others to become part of this process in rethinking our local history, making discoveries alongside us, making meaningful connections to the lives of folks who lived before us. We created a call class through Keene State College that was opened up to both call students and traditional students, and I think it might have been the first, but COVID hit and our class was canceled. Not to be deterred, we had heard that the Monadnock Center for History and Culture in Peterborough had also started doing research. And so we decided to partner together, move forward, and create this as a virtual project. A lot of libraries and historical societies had shut down, so it had to be a virtual project. We advertised for volunteers, and we had 12 volunteers answer the call to join the small team of volunteers already working in Peterborough. Each has been assigned to one or more towns. 38 towns are included in this project across Cheshire and Hillsborough counties. And support for this initial phase of the project came through a National Endowment for the Humanities Sharp Grant and the Putnam Foundation. I just want to take a moment. Here's some of our volunteers. Surprise if you're in the room. To add that our volunteers have been truly wonderful. And I want to thank all of them for their time and dedication, especially for your patience over the many needle in the haystack days you have spent doing this research. I also want to acknowledge our citizen archivist, Kenneth Jew, who recently passed away. His contributions to this project in studying Westmoreland has been critical as we uncover or recover Black history in the Monadnock region. If you are a citizen archivist as part of this project, can you raise your hand? So thank you. Thank you all. So the goals for our project, one is to enhance our understanding of the past in Southwest New Hampshire and acknowledge the fact that Black history and the history of marginalized groups are an integral part of our state's history. To integrate more diverse primary sources into school resources that we lend out to local educators for free. To use our findings to create new educational programs for the general public. To build up our archive and fill gaps in our collections. To share research findings with the Black Heritage Trail of New Hampshire. And to compare our findings with other projects occurring around the state and into Vermont and Massachusetts. So our first step was to create a method to systematically examine documents. With so many repositories closed during the pandemic, we really needed sources that were accessible online. And it was important, too, that we did this research source by source. We understood that if we focused on a person or a family, we would trace that person and then their relatives, and we'd end up way over here in a wormhole and forget where we left off. We also knew that volunteers come and go, and we needed to know where the last person left off so another volunteer could step in. So it would be much more efficient to know that we all systematically covered census records, town histories, birth records, etc. for each of the towns. So we created a Google form for the project, so every time a volunteer enters data into the form, it populates into a much larger spreadsheet. And at this point, we have about 1,800 entries into this spreadsheet. Every month, I go and pull all of Cheshire County towns from that spreadsheet into my own, which is quite large, about 1,300 entries. And then it could get sorted by town or decade or by name, etc. So the bulk of this project has been collecting data using primary sources and sorting them into spreadsheets. If you're in my line of work, that sounds extremely exciting. So we started with census records. They're accessible online. Analyzing them would give us a good list of names that we could then use in other places. Census records would also provide us with a rough timeline of African American history in the region as it's changed over time. So our plan is to be able to analyze age demographics, gender demographics, patterns of movement through New England, common occupations, or even geographic locations within each of our towns, if possible. So it was important that our citizen archivists analyze the original handwritten sources as much as possible rather than relying on transcriptions. In an effort not to duplicate mistakes, but we also realized that information about a person of color could get written in the sides of a page or the bottom of a page, and therefore we'd be missing information if we relied on a transcription. So the analysis of 14 census years across 23 Cheshire County towns took a year. There were some difficulties, which I need to share with all of you now. The 1890 census, for instance, was destroyed in a fire, so very little survives across the country, not in New England. So we knew we were going to be missing 1881 to 1899, a lot of what was happening in our region. Some of the country's earliest census, as we mentioned before, list the head of household. So they don't list the names of anyone else residing within the household, and this meant that most people living under the head of household was anonymous, including enslaved individuals or free persons of color. The only chance we had of finding people of color in these early years is if the head of household was a person of color. Anyone else, we'd hope to fill in names as we continue to go through other sources. I point out here an example of one we found. Benjamin Benoni lived in Fitzwilliam in 1820, and he is the head of household. And if you scroll across these columns, the first columns are all for white male and female. Towards the end would be free persons of color, male and female. So we have a male and a female living in this household. We also found his marriage record. He was married the year before in 1819. And so this is he and his new bride living together in Fitzwilliam. Interestingly enough, there were 3 couples of color in 1819 getting married at the same time. So that's something else. For Fitzwilliam, we're really interested in learning about this relationship between these families and how they came to Fitzwilliam. We know Benjamin was from Jaffrey and moved to Fitzwilliam when he got married. The 1790 census in our region listed the entire county together. It didn't separate them by town. We didn't realize this. And so we assigned all of our volunteers to go into the census. Don't search for a name. We'd be searching for the town. So say the volunteer in Marlow is looking in the 1790 census for Marlow residents, and then the volunteer in Winchester is doing the same. And they're both getting the same list of names. And so we suddenly had volunteers extremely excited to have discovered so many people of color living in their communities until we realized that everybody had the same list. So this took a while for us to really sort through and figure out who was from which town. And luckily there had been a publication that did that, that helped us do that work. But this meant then we had to clean up a lot of records, and poor volunteers had spent so much time entering in each individual entry for the county. So I wanted to point out that, I'm getting a yellow light. I don't know if we have batteries, but all right, we'll figure it out. Lois Bordeaux. She has a connection in Keene, but she's also living elsewhere in the county. There's somebody through the Peterborough group that is researching her more, but she's listed as a head of household, and there's 6 people of color, free people of color living in that household. So that's going to become a story or a presentation that we will have soon, is more on her. The 1810 census drove us crazy. The last 2 columns of the census, which would have listed anyone who's a free person of color or an enslaved person, is cut off in the census. So we're missing that data. And so the microfilm, it's the same. So we need to figure out what's happening here. And so that's really skewed our numbers. And so the questions on the census have changed over time, as you can start to see. So census takers were actually, if you might not know this, but census takers were the ones responsible for assigning race. And that was in place for quite a while into the 20th century. And really being allowed to self-identify came with things like, in 1960, the first mail-in census forms. So the categories were meager for years, and as the nation's becoming more diverse, you can see where this is creating a situation for our government. I thought it would be interesting just to show you or run through various census years what those categories of race were. So in the earliest ones, you have free white, slave, or all other free person. This might be a free person of color, but it also might be an indentured servant or an apprentice. And we're finding this is extremely prevalent in this region. If you were a family and finding it difficult to get by, you may indenture your children out. We're finding it more likely that that happened. It was quite common in this area for teenagers to get indentured out. And so we need to then differentiate between people. 1820s to 40s, you see free white slave, and then it becomes free colored person. So by 1850, the government begins to differentiate between somebody who's black and somebody who is mixed race. This is also an era where there's an influx of Irish immigrants coming into the country, and so the government starts to wonder, where's everyone born? And so you see origin of birth added to the census. 1860 to 80, here you can notice we start to then track Native Americans and Asians, which meant you were Chinese at this time, but black and mulatto remained terms. The 1890 census, as I mentioned, is largely destroyed, but it's important to show because it's you can see that the government is really trying to figure out how black a person might be. And so there's all these categories then. Mulatto meant that you might, or a half black, half non. And then there's even quarter black and 1/8 black in that census. 1900, 1910, then the terminology changes. And so now the term Negro is indicating somebody who is mixed race. And by 1920, you can see that Asian population has expanded. I love that you could be Hindu. And then the 1930 census is noteworthy as well because it's notable for institutionalizing the one drop rule through instructions given to census takers. So the mulatto category is dropped, but anyone with a precipitable trace of black blood was designated as Negro. And more generally, then, the mix of white and non-white should have been reported according to the non-white parent. And so I think, that's important for our volunteers and for us to understand as we're going through these records. In addition, Mexican is introduced as a racial category. Prior to that, Mexicans might be included in white or any of the other categories. So despite the fact Latinos of some of the earliest residents of our country, they weren't acknowledged as a racial category actually until 1970 as Latin American. So even though white has been a category in every census, those who identified as white, it's fluid. There's an entire history of Americans trying to pass as much as possible as white to avoid discrimination or to have access to more resources. And we found individuals listed as white in the census in one year and another race in another year. So is this person self-identifying, or is this the census taker seeing something themselves as a question? And what this tells us is that not everybody's racial identity or ethnicity fits neatly into a box. And we need to understand that. So we're researching families who may or may not fit within the parameters of this project. And it leaves us with this question then, how do we define Black when we're calling this a Recovering Black History project? And I'm not saying that as if we have that figured out. We have a lot of conversations about this. So in year 2, we had completed most all census records and moved to town and county histories. Many are available on archives.org. And for this portion of the project, we were really interested in publications written at the turn of the 20th century. It had become very popular across the country following the Civil War and surrounding the commemoration of our nation's centennial in 1876 to publish a history of one's town. These histories often included chapters on early settlement period up to the Industrial Revolution. Authors used a mix of primary source info, anecdotes from members of the community, and they're often meant to paint a picture of the good old days and commemorate hard work and determination of our town's earliest settlers. Often there's a section in those town histories that includes biographies of some of the important town folk, especially the wealthiest, the military officers, and the town officials. Today, we recognize that many of these town histories offer some flawed information about the past. Many of them romanticize or even stereotype people of color or left them out of the history books completely. It's also important to note that in a post-Civil War era, many towns in New England were quick to emphasize, too, their abolitionist sentiments of people in their communities, while de-emphasizing New England's role in the slave trade and perpetuating the institution of slavery into the mid-19th century. So our research is recovering some of that truth, and we'll show you a little bit later. But what do our town histories offer us then? Studies of individuals, stories of individuals of color, even if flawed, at least provide us with names and some clues. Biographies of wealthy military histories can mention persons of color as well. What we found is that these references listed in town histories help to verify some information that we had in our census records. It also gave us names of individuals we didn't know yet. So this is from the History of Surrey, and it lists a list of residences in that publication. Number 242 is Old Dolby the Negro for whom Nigger Hollow is named, who lived in the area in about 1834, 1835. And what we've been able to determine is Charles Dolby, we know, lived on the Surrey-Keene line. So this would be past the hospital, heading up just in that town line. We see some more references to it in the early 20th century when they're trying to expand the highway to Surrey, and they had to cut out sections of that area. So we do see a few references to this section of town. And so at least now we have an idea of maybe Charles Dolby and his family was living there, but maybe other families lived there over time. And so at least it gives us something to work with. And it wasn't in Keene's history, it was in Surrey's. So it's important to be looking all over. So let's revisit Phoebe Simmons. Keene resident Charles L. Barrett conducted a presentation for the Historical Society of Cheshire County on March 18, 1929. His talk was entitled Main Street in the 1870s. In it, he recalls with vivid detail the homes along Main Street where he grew up and the stories of residents on the street. In it, he talks about playing at the Robinson House in the 1870s as a child. And I'd like to read you a small section of that now, after I take these off. So here I wish to mention a character who played a part in the lives of young people who lived in the neighborhood. Some of you may remember old Aunt Phoebe Simmons, a colored woman who lived for many years in the family of Jonathan Robinson, as well as in the family of his father before him. Aunt Phoebe was a character in every sense. She was considerably under 5 feet in height and of liberal dimensions, both north and south and east and west. And with her colored handkerchief covering her head, she made a typical picture of old Southern mammy. She was of a very variable temperament. She assumed the general oversight of the young people in the neighborhood. And I might add that even the older ones were not exempt from her scrutiny. I'll not say she ruled with a rod of iron, but almost. She had 2 very effective weapons with which to enforce her authority. As for example, the Robinson buildings, with the long row of sheds and barns, made an attractive place for the boys to gather for fun. Mr. and Mrs. Robinson were fond of young people and did not object to having them run about the buildings as long as they didn't do any mischief. But with Aunt Phoebe, it was quite a trial. I had seen her many a time, after an unusual outburst of noise from children, rush out like a roaring lion, waving her favorite weapons for quelling riotous proceedings, a chunk of cake in one hand and a butcher's knife in the other. The cake was a reward if we would go away and never come back. The butcher's knife was to cut off our ears if we did not go. At the heart, Aunt Phoebe was pure gold, as I knew her from watchful and loving care and comfort and the well-being of Mr. and Mrs. Robinson. Aunt Phoebe at her worst was better than most of us at our best. She died December 9th, 1886, at 86 years of age, and is buried in the Robinson lot at Woodland Cemetery. So here we have some basic description of Phoebe, some physical characteristics, her presence within the neighborhood. She is remembered affectionately by Barrett. And so even though this is both romanticized and stereotyped, it seems at the same time, it gives us some more information that we wouldn't have had or we wouldn't have been able to gather from census records or death records, for instance. So using lists of people we developed for each town, we asked volunteers then to locate birth, death, marriage records, even if it brought us outside of New Hampshire to other towns and states. This is what our volunteers have been working on most recently and where we need to finish up. So taking everything into account, we now have a much better position to see what life was like for individuals and families of color over time in the Monadnock region. We can also make connections between towns now. I wanted to call your attention to these 3. The first one is a death record. Lorenzo Willard died of consumption in Winchester in 1865. But our Swansea volunteer knew this name because he was born Lorenzo Dow His mother, Esther Willard, seems to have had a child out of wedlock, and Lorenzo was raised by his grandparents in Swansea. And so what we find here is this is probably his first exit from the family household, and he was about 19, 20 years old at the time that he died. The next one is a marriage record, Amos Freeman and Amy Humphrey from Fitzwilliam. This is one of our other couples from 1819, who of the three who were married around the same time. And so we'd really love to know more about them. And then the other one is a birth record, Merrill Daniels Freeman, born 1803 in Sullivan, New Hampshire. From the Sullivan town history, we had learned that the Freeman family had moved to town at some point. And so for us to find birth records and find those names then of the parents that we knew, Peter and Kate Freeman, now we can begin to piece together a timeline of when they were there, living there. So that's exciting for us. So now, every once in a while I get curious and create new spreadsheets. And I want to know, like, okay, how many people are living in town? What are we noticing here as far as population demographics go? And this changes every time I do this. We have so many volunteers entering data, and then it's always out of date. So this is out of date already. But one of the things that I want to point out is some of the towns, there may be one person in a community. And what we're finding over and over again is that there's probably a lot of stories of solitude and loneliness in rural New Hampshire towns like ours. And where there's larger spikes, it might just be one or two families. And so it's interesting to look at this. I was curious to see then by decade how this is shaping out, and I'll say this will change as we discover more information. The 1810 census is much less as far as our numbers go. The 1890 census is almost nothing. So where we're able to find information is through those birth, death, and marriage records and other information. So we'll continue to work on that. But you can see that we have evidence of people of color living here as early as the 1730s. So we're really working hard to figure out the stories of as many people as possible. The other thing I really wanted to understand is how has the story changed? And so what was happening up to the 1850s or through the 1850s, and then what was happening post-Civil War in 1860s up. So the areas marked in red, this is by town. You can start to see the towns where there were populations of people of color living before the Civil War and how that shifted or changed post-Civil War. And so we know then there's a story here that we need to analyze or study a bit more, and how much of that is related to, say, the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 or the introduction of the train and railroad and industries that grew up around them where people moved. So there's lots of variables that we could be looking at with that. So what are the potential topics or trends we want to investigate? I'm curious about that the 18th century to mid-19th century local history looks different from the late 19th to early 20th century. Part of that, too, is the hotel industry, tourism industry. And so we find a lot of individuals working in hotels. And that for many individuals, too, that this could be a lonely existence. And so how are there ways of making connections to others in your community or across the region? That there are few families of color moving here and staying here is significant. There are a fair number of veterans of color following the American Revolution moving into Southwest New Hampshire and resettling and starting new lives. And so that's another topic of study that we'd like to examine. We're also finding instances of Native women marrying Black men and residing in Southwest New Hampshire. So there's a relationship worth exploring there as well. I'm also surprised at the number of times that a person's color or race is not mentioned on a document. And so the census records specifically ask for that, but then we need to be able to know those names to go into other records because it's not always listed. And that these racial categories, again, are limiting. So some immigrants are labeled as Black or Indian. We have Syrian families here, Turkish families, Chinese families, and so Abenaki families, and everybody's sort of mixed in, and it changes over time. There are still sources that we need to review. Some online, but we're getting into the thick of it where we're going to be heading into town halls and city halls to look for information. One thing would be probate records, my least favorite thing to look at, but I see my volunteer, Becky, laughing because she likes to look at this, so I think I'm going to be sending some stuff her way. But they're fascinating. It's just a lot of reading messy handwriting. And so when you're looking at somebody's probate records, then you might find a will. You might find information regarding how much money was owed to the person or how much money they owe. There might be an inventory of their household. And so within these records, for Whitehead's household, we may find, we've found evidence of people are kind of getting paid or receiving pensions for their long service to the family, etc. Or that somebody is then given to a family member if it's an enslaved person of color. So there's some mentions in there that we really need to be looking at, everybody in the area. This is a rare one. I think we've found two so far that I know of. Ferry W. Freeman was a person of color living in Marlborough in 1837. And by looking at his probate records, we found a note from his boss. He was a painter. But he got sick, and he was staying in somebody else in the community's household for about 6 months, being cared for, and he died. And so this person was writing and saying, he did work for me, and so I know he owes money should be paid to the person who cared for him. And so they're doing a list of inventory to see how much value there was and what he owned. And from this, we can see that he has a lot of books and a lot of writing materials. So he could read and write. We know that. We know about some of his clothing. We see his paint supplies. And we also see that he owned a fiddle and a flute. So he could have been a musician. And so it's fascinating to look at these. Military records. So those veterans of the American Revolution, we need to be looking up as much as we can about them. Pompey Woodward is from Sullivan. He died in 1856. His wife, Mary, is looking for to receive his pension, and so there's records in there of that. And so unfortunately, not too long after this, her house burns down, and she moves back to Massachusetts, where the family had come from originally. Town records, selectmen minutes, another fun read. So we're going to delve into this. There's some important things that can happen from here, like those marriage vital statistic information we can find. This is Peter Barker, who married Elithina Dorchester in Sullivan in 1805. We know that the Freeman family and the Dorchester family moved up, and they were all intermarrying, and Peter Barker gets in on the mix. And so there's these families developing in Sullivan in the late 1700s, early 1800s, which is really interesting. A lot of them, they're all connected to Sterling, Massachusetts. And so there's something there then that we're going to be going to Sterling, Massachusetts. What is this connection that we can find of families moving in and out of the area? The other thing we're going to find in town records or be looking for are warnings out. Just this week, we found a warning out of Swansea, 1798, I believe. A husband and wife and their 4 children are living in Swansea. Apparently, he mustn't have means to care for them enough. And so the selectmen have met and decided that they're warned out of town, which means they have so many days legally to get out of town and move back to Massachusetts. And so warnings out were quite common in our area. Something else that we may find are what we've seen is auctions to the lowest bidder. So in the instance of, say, somebody, an elderly woman, Mrs. Smith, who can no longer care for herself, in the early days, then they might say, before there were systems in place to help care for the elderly, the town might say, we're looking for somebody to care for Mrs. Smith in her home. And that person, somebody says, I'll do it for £5. Somebody else says, I'll do it for £3. And there you go. Mrs. Smith is moving in with the £3 family. And so there's instances there where we can be looking for who's caring for who in the community. So that might match up to some of the census records as well. So we need to be looking for that. Looking at maps. So we saw the mention before for the Surrey to Keene line. There's another one here I've seen in the Richmond town history when talking about Reuben Jidham, who was another Rev War veteran who moved into the area and settled here with a wife and children, that he was from Guinea, Africa. So we see that term. And here's a map of Richmond that lists Guinea as a section of town. So is this something then that we can be looking at maps, researching old maps, and trying to find some of these places where people might have lived? And maybe then it's plans. Abel Blake, the Horatio Colony House was built by Abel Blake. In 1805, he's working on plans and working to, and I'm not going to say I understand plans all that well, but we've got plans here for that property, and included in that in two documents we found is Captain Blake's Negro lot, and William as the name of a person of color living at the Blake residence. So there's more that we can be learning here as well. And of course, photographs. We have 20,000 plus photographs in our collection, not to mention what there might be in all the other collections in historical societies around the Monadnock region. And so the more that we can do to identify people of color, the more likely it is that we're going to be able to identify individuals in photographs. This is a photograph of a school in Keene. We don't know the school and we don't know the date. So it's that's our first step. So we are going to try to see if we can find, if this is a popular spot where the school class pictures were taken, maybe we have another photo in our collection that would then identify the school. And so we're going to try to work on that to see what we can do. And that's just some of the stuff. We have church records, deeds, court records, correspondence, diaries. And so it's a lot of reading and attention to detail as we move through this. One of the things that has been a great help to this project recently is that the Keene Sentinel was digitized 1799 to 1945. It's accessible on our website, and I know there's plans or talk about maybe trying to see how we can expand that further. But for us, that means we can be looking at looking up some of these names, but also looking for instances of, say, runaway ads are quite common. It may be runaway ad for an enslaved person, an apprentice, an indentured servant, and working through that to see who we can identify. This one, I picked this one because it says that they have a dark complexion. Is that a clue? Then is this somebody that we want to try to research and see if we can find out more about? Or the person from Swansea who's put the ad in the paper. And this is great because this is an ad from Cyrus Palmer, who had moved to town. He's a farrier, so he can take care of your horses, dock your horses, trim their hooves, what have you. And so he's putting out an ad in 1799 in Keene as a black man working, staying at Dr. Edwards' house in Keene. And the town history mentions that he was the first veterinarian in town. So here's somebody else that wouldn't be great if we could find out more information. And now let's get back to Phoebe. Phoebe Simmons once more. So on December 29th, 1886, the Sentinel reported on the death of Phoebe. Miss Phoebe Simmons, an old and established colored woman who had been in the Robinson family for over 60 years, died at the residence of Charles D. Robinson at the age of 86. So we find that Phoebe Simmons died of old age, according to Robinson, where she worked as a domestic in his family's household for generations. And according to the town history, she was affectionately known as Aunt Phoebe by local townspeople. This is great given the fact that at this time, it wasn't necessarily a common occurrence to have your death notice published in the paper. We didn't have the obligatory obituary section necessarily yet. So to have her death notice in the paper is a great way of finding out more about her. So we find that, quote, she was born in Rockingham, Vermont in 1800 and was given by Mrs. Margaret Baxter of Surrey to her granddaughter, Mrs. Jonathan Robinson, 63 years ago, since which time she's remained in the family, end quote. So given as a present, a wedding present to a granddaughter stands out. And what this tells us is that Phoebe Simmons was enslaved at a young age. And later, at the age of about 23, she was simply given to another family member. And the fact is that while many of us grew up learning that slavery is an institution present only in the South, it did in fact exist in the North. And not only that, it existed in New Hampshire and in Monadnock Region. So we have evidence of slavery in Cheshire County as early as the 1730s and as late as 1850s. In fact, we've now found evidence of enslaved persons of color living in Alstead, Chesterfield, Gilsum, Hinsdale, Keene, Rindge, Surrey, Stoddard, Sullivan, Swansea, Walpole, Westmoreland, and Winchester. 13 out of the 23 towns we're researching. That's almost 60% of Cheshire County communities. But for years we heard a different story, that it never existed, or that it existed but enslaved individuals were treated like any other member of the family in the North. These statements are myths that have been dispelled in more recent years through some basic research in our own state's written and oral traditions. According to the 1820 federal U.S. Census, there were no persons in color enslaved in New Hampshire at that time. Yet here we're learning that Phoebe was an enslaved woman of color in the 1820s in our own region. So what more can we come to know about Phoebe Simmons? What was her life like as she served multiple generations of the same family? And can we find out more about Phoebe's family in Vermont? According to this death notice in the Sentinel, Phoebe left behind a sister in 1886, who at the time of her death was 90 years old and living in Charlestown, New Hampshire. So we know that they knew of each other. And could an investigation into her sister's life lead to more details or clues about Phoebe's life? Could this help explain how the institution of slavery continued to exist in New Hampshire into the 19th century, even though our official national census indicates otherwise? So as you can see, the more we recover about Black history in the Monadnock region, the more questions we have. Our goals for 2023, let me stop and say this is where Phoebe is buried at Woodland Cemetery is off Beaver Street. And so we have that noted. She's with the Robinson family. And so when we saw her in that first census living with Jonathan Robinson, they were close in age. They grew up together. And so it's interesting to see. So in 2023, we're going to continue to follow threads of information and get enough research on an individual or family on our list. Do some biographies, mini bios that we could share with all of you through presentations or a blog. We're constructing a website right now to allow users to do research sorted by town or by name, thanks to support from CNS Wholesale Grocers and the Putnam Foundation. We're also partnering with the Keene Heritage Commission, who received a grant to help us with our research on residents of color in Keene between 1730 and 1930. The Heritage Commission is also going to try to help us create an interactive online map of Black history in Keene and help contextualize our findings, which can feed both the map and our website. We hope this will become a template that we can then use for other towns. We'd like our research to get analyzed and contextualized by historians of African American history. We'd like our research to get used by authors, poets, artists, local teachers in our schools. We'd like our research to develop into new educational programs, walking tours, driving tours, films, publications. We'd like our research to get turned over to the Black Heritage Trail of New Hampshire. They have a statewide database that they've been adding information to. So can we get all of this information together? We'd like to revisit the topic of the Underground Railroad in our region, if possible, to learn more about those who could have helped orchestrate it. And as a historical organization, with a historic house built in the 1760s, we'd like to reconcile our interest in colonial history while accurately and thoughtfully unpacking that word, colonial. We'd like to commemorate the strength and resilience of a more diverse, more inclusive body of our residents, while also acknowledging the pain and suffering of others associated with this project. So I hope that this provides you with some insight into our project, enough that you'll keep tabs on us as we continue to pour through sources. We expect this to be a multi-year initiative that offers new opportunities to share with the public again and again. I would like to invite you to return. February 22nd, 2 of our citizen archivists involved with this project will present stories based on our research. Michelle Stahl, Executive Director of the Monadnock Center for History and Culture, will share the life of Baker Moore of 1830s Peterborough. And New Hampshire archaeologist Gail Golick will share what she is learning about the Brooks family who lived in Walpole in the 1850s. So I'd like to thank you all for listening in on what we're up to here, and I'd be happy to answer any questions if I could. So thank you.
Thank you.
Unbelievable. That's all you got to say? Wow.
Yeah, we would like this to be something that every year we're adding some new dimension to understanding our community's history. So there's a lot, 458 names. That's identified individuals. So that's not those unidentified free and enslaved people of color that we see in our census records. So we hope to expand that as well.
Is there any evidence of auction?
No, we haven't found any evidence of auctions here, but I'm not sure. We haven't really figured out how is it that enslaved people were entering the state, and what were the connections elsewhere to Portsmouth or other seaport towns where we might expect to see that. I'm not really sure how that was all working. It's a question we have. Another question is, how does a 14-year-old boy from Kentucky end up in like Roxbury in 1860 by himself? What were those networks and what was going on? Yes.
One African American whose name people know is his famous Fortune.
Yes.
Is a review or re-looking at his history part of what your project might involve?
Yes, absolutely. So we'll be doing, and I'll say, so the Monadnock Center, we partnered with them. We took all the towns and we split it like 20 towns. And so one of their volunteers is working on Jaffrey. So I'm constantly looking at that big spreadsheet, like, come on, Jaffrey, like, what are you going to give me? So we'll be getting into, by source, what are those sources tied to Amos Fortune's life? We do know that the Black Heritage Trail in New Hampshire is also working on something. They'd love to see a historical marker. So I've seen reference to that as well. So I think there's going to be more attention given to Amos. And you see the book around that kids used to read in school and too. And so maybe there's some really good opportunity to revisit his life in Jaffrey. Yes.
You alluded to the 1850 Fugitive Act.
Yes.
Do we have records, either town records or newspaper clippings, that deal with that might maybe talk about enslaved people who were sent back, or any public opinion on that act?
Yeah, so the Fugitive Slave Act, 1850, it's interesting because as we go through this project, we're also finding references to national events that what was Keene aware of this region aware of. So we know it was being reported in the newspaper. We know that. We have a diary of an 18-year-old girl, Martha Wilson. And we had high school students a few years ago transcribe her diary. And in it, she's mentioning every week she'd mention the sermon that her minister gave. And so he was explaining how horrible this event was to his congregation. And she mentions that in her diary. So we know there's an awareness of it. And so for us, it's also taking, okay, here's an interesting topic, or a huge KKK rally in the 1920s over in West Keene. We need to be gathering all of this information to help us contextualize our findings. So I think there's references to it, but nothing specific that we've found so far to any action that was happening around that. Not that I know of. No. Okay. Yeah.
Just a thought with regard to auctions. Were there any auctions, and how did some of these people end up in these remote rural areas? I don't know if you or anyone is familiar with the Dublin seminar, so-called, for the Dublin School. That's where it held its first gathering. And in 2003, I think each year they have a thematic topic. And in 2003, it was slavery and anti-slavery in New England. And so one of the things I want to mention is that a minister, if I recall correctly, went to Newport, Rhode Island, and where he purchased 3 slaves, and came back to Northampton where he lived. So also a minister in Northfield owned a slave, and there was quite a hoopla apparently amongst the local townspeople over that. So so local people probably traveled elsewhere to purchase.
And you're bringing up another interesting thing that we've noticed. Those earliest years, we're finding that who were the people who then enslaved others? It might be the local minister. The lawyer. When you think about people who, it seems, had jobs where they were moving out and about and around, then you need enough people in your household to maintain your farm and your household too. We're seeing a connection to Deerfield, Mass. in early years, 1730s, especially in Hinsdale. The families that were helping to establish Hinsdale were Deerfield families, many of them slave-owning families. So we're seeing some connections there. So mentioning ministers is interesting. Yes.
Michael Turner, my family goes back in this country to 1670 as far as documentation is concerned. And it occurred because there was an indentured servant named Mary Farrell who came over from Ireland, and she was working with the Bradford family plantation in the area of Maryland and Virginia. And at that time, indentured servants and slaves were housed in the same quarters. Mary ended up pregnant, and Bradford wanted to know who the father was, and she would not reveal, so they tied her to a tree and commenced to give her the lash. And after beating her about 28 times, Bradford decided that he would not continue doing that because he would kill her and wait until the baby was born. When the baby was born, Bradford declared that he was going to sell that baby as a slave, and Mary indicated that she was a free British citizen, and therefore the baby was a free British citizen. And Bradford was hesitant in terms of doing that. He went to the court. Now this is before 1670, before the country is essentially a country, but they had the court system there. And it went to the court, and the court determined that the baby was a free child, but had to retain the name Farrell and had to stay in a certain geographical area. And the family continues up until my great-grandmother, Emma Farrell, who essentially then got married later on in the late 1800s, 1900s, when slavery was outlawed, to George Turner. That's how my name Turner, but essentially it can be traced back to the Farrell. And in addition to that, when Mary had her children, Thomas had married Amanda and had 3 children there, Peter, Mosley, and Cicely. They had children continued up to Benjamin Farrell, who was, as you indicated, people indentured their children out because they couldn't take care of them. So Benjamin was indentured out. and the individual that he was indentured to was drafted to serve in the Continental Army. Instead of he going, he mandated that Benjamin serve in the Continental Army, whereupon Benjamin did 2 years, and upon completing his service of 2 years in the Continental service, he was supposed to get land and money, but the farmer kept the land and the money. It went to court and was resolved in 1835, awarded to Benjamin Farrell. But that Benjamin Farrell, who has served, is now deceased, and it goes to his grandson, Benjamin Farrell, who was the father of Henry Farrell, who was the father of Emma Farrell, who was my great-grandmother. In addition to that, in terms of doing the DNA research, found out that I have Angolan ancestry DNA. And the Angolan ancestry is interesting because in the area of Virginia, North Carolina, where a lot of slaves were, Massachusetts was one of the largest slave states in the colonial period. And that occurred because there are two brothers, Anthony Johnson and his brother, who was mulatto, from the Caribbean, who would bring slaves up here and sell them to the farmers who needed labor. So it began to grow, and that's it. But in any event, in the 1620s, there was slavery that was occurring between the Portuguese going to Angola and taking them, bringing them to Mexico to work in the mines there. The British were concerned about that because Portugal was getting very powerful and very rich, but did not want to go to war against Portugal because Portugal was a Catholic country, and if Great Britain went to war against Portugal, then France and Italy and Spain were going to join in with Portugal. So what they did is they commissioned pirates, and they called them privateers, and they would raid these ships. There were two ships, the Adventurer and the Treasure Hunt, who raided the ship, the San Juan Bautista, in the Bay of Campeche, and took these slaves, 600 slaves, off that ship. 300 of them they brought to the Caribbean, and 300 of them they brought to Comfort Point, which later became Jamestown, Virginia, which later became Hampton, Virginia. So that's when the Angolan DNA comes in, those particular individuals. So essentially that's traced back to that individual who then impregnated.
That's amazing. It's amazing you have all that in your head. First of all, let me say thank you. Thank you for sharing. Yeah, but it'll be interesting too. And what that calls to mind for me is we would love to be able to connect then with descendants of people who were in this area in some way.
Incidentally, I'm the first black person in the history of Massachusetts to be appointed principal of a public high school. So that was Cambridge Latin School, which is now called Cambridge Region.
Oh, wow. So speaking of that, do you anticipate that this initiative will find a way to involve children and schools, and both in terms of being researchers as well as being part of local history curriculum?
Yeah, we're always looking to bring youth into what we do. Bringing schools in, usually then that means we create all the work, and then we create the opportunity for them to make discoveries, so that we have enough materials for everyone. We've run into situations in the past where, say, we have teachers who are interested in doing something on the Civil War and come to us and say, I want every child of mine to have a Civil War soldier, and they all have to be buried in the same cemetery. And so so we like to kind of create projects, and we know then that every child, and then it's why did this child get a diary and this child didn't, and so we try to create some controlled project that would allow for those discoveries. So we do those quite often over the years we have, and so we're always looking for opportunities to continue to do that, and that's a big part of this project. So the next time a teacher asks, then what do you have on Civil War soldiers, that we're also incorporating, there's a young man from Swansea, I believe, Alonzo Pease, who has fought in the Civil War as a soldier of color, so that we're incorporating more diverse history. Yes.
So I thank you for sharing all that context, and I feel like the context is so amazing to get this whole project that you're engaged in And I find it really inspiring as part of sort of this reckoning that our nation is trying to go through with our history. And so I just want to I want to say that part of the context that's in my mind, and as you know, sitting here, is my understanding, which is open to correction, that Keene is named for a slaveholder, that it was given, the Keene was named as an honor to somebody who was never connected to Keene, but was a slaveholder amongst other things. So the context for all this history is that it took place in a town that's named for a slave trader.
But also you have to know that large number of the people of color in this country were not all slaves. There were a significant number of free blacks. By the Civil War, there were 4 million blacks in this country, and 10% of them were free blacks, over 400,000. The majority of them being located in areas of Richmond, Virginia, Charleston, New Orleans, etc. As a matter of fact, during the Civil War, you had an all-black regiment that was fighting for the Confederates. And when they were captured by the Union, they were given the option of either fighting with the Union or going to prison, and they opted to fight with the Union. So you had a lot of stories that were existent that, you know, are different than what one has read growing up in.
And that brings up a good point. I think for school children or the general public, any ways that we can be connecting local history to national events and what was going on nationally is going to be vital to this project. It has relevance, and it brings new voices to something that we've heard as part of the overarching history. And I think, you know, there's always room then to say, here's another piece of that story that you may not have heard about or understood completely. And I hope we're able to do that through local history. Because there's so much there's so much history out there, and thinking beyond even just the military history, our understanding of what else was going on and how people were helping shape our communities in new ways as we move forward.
And finally, I want to say that Barack Obama was not the first black president of the United States, because Warren Harding was identifiable in terms of black, and the newspaper were making an issue about it until his wife Florence invited all of the major editors of newspapers to her home for a party. And it was tradition that when you had a large party like that, after the dinner, the men would go into the smoking room and the women would go into the tea room. So all the men went into the smoking room and the women in the tea room, and then the door slammed, and Florence was standing there with a pistol saying that the next editor that prints anything about her husband using the N-word, she's going to personally blow his head off. That document is in the Smithsonian. You can
Wow.
Well, anyone else have a question or a comment? Yes.
I don't know how far you can trace this, or the relationship with Native Americans and the Black community.
Yeah, there's some instances that we're noticing, and a lot of it, you know, we have stories from town histories and such, so it's trying to piece that information together. There's Scipio Jaha from Fitzwilliam was married to a Native American woman. Gail is doing research. You want to raise your hand? One of our next stories that we'll be sharing, Gail has been doing research on a family from Walpole that's connected to Native American history out of Connecticut, I believe. And so there's quite a few instances. It's really difficult to find those sources to do that research, but we're trying. Yeah. Yes.
You never cease to take the high regard I have for you and to blow it out of the water.
Thanks, Bill. Thank you very much. Well, I'm, you know, we can't do this without all the volunteers that are helping us. And so, you know, creating a new sense of history and connecting to the past in new ways is what we're about. So projects like this are meaningful and exciting at the same time. So thank you all for hearing. Yes. Oh.
It's a tiny thing. It looks
I just want to point out when you made the point about why Hindu was listed on the census.
Yeah.
Because that was a general term for people who came from the area of so-called Hindustan. In fact, the name India itself is derived from Hindu, so it's just another word for India.
Yeah, that's right. Right. Very good. Thank you.